Great.
So
All
can
right.
you individually take someone's picture off?
No, you would just
Oh, I would do
stop
it.
video. Yeah, you would just
Okay.
stop video. If you wanted to be on. Right. So if if you do that, like in general with every Zoom call, if you want to be recognized, then you can't wave your physical hand. You'll have to use your virtual hand. Or put your name in chat.
Well, we can
Saying,
do that, right? There we go. See? Okay.
yeah.
All right. It's under reactions in case anybody else wanted to know.
Right. All right. And then the other thing is before we get started, if people do want to, contribute, please do just say, if you care to. Again, this is being recorded, so it's optional, but just in the manner of community, say who you are and where you're from. That'd be cool. All right. So thanks so much. The fourth and final session of Gaveling Down the Rabble, dealing with the last two chapters. The last, second to last one deals with sort of the three arenas of constituencies or issue areas that the Commerce Clause became the go-to mechanism, and I guess the term would be constitutional foundation, to try to legitimize that particular set of law. The first one being that we looked at was civil rights, second environmental, or was it the other way around? And this third being in labor. It's not a long chapter at all, but it continues the quest. It underscores, I believe, and we can get into it, the overarching or undergirding sense that when it comes to civil rights and workers' rights, those are not how these laws are defended. It's under commerce. So property rights takes trumps everything else. When it comes to the environment, it's the same thing. Environment is commodified in terms of commercial benefit over the inherent value of nature itself as a living entity and as an absolute necessity for every other living being and beings, as well as inanimate objects, to exist, including us. So that's what that chapter deals with, and there's much to be said in it. And then the last chapter sort of tries to establish the summation that begins sort of interestingly with the court. I think it was like 1995, between 1995 and 2000, sort of dialing back in a couple of instances this sort of blanket effort at defining anything that comes before it that is going to promote property as commerce. And so it sort of dialed it back a bit, but for somewhat nefarious purposes that Jane Ann goes into. We can get into that. And then she, sort of ends, sort of as this whole book began, by talking about how free trade from an international perspective ain't all that different than free trade from a domestic perspective. And that while there has been tremendous activism, not quite as much sort of since 9/11, but certainly from WTO days through the Free Trade Agreement of Americas before 9/11 happened, tremendous anti-corporate globalization organizing. It still is around G, fill in the blank, 7, 12, 10, 8, depending on what year and time period and political realities we have. But also, that's kind of where we are, where there's that sort of opposition. But when it comes to dealing with the Commerce Clause, there isn't the same type of organized effort. So she goes into that and gives some areas of and ideas and specific suggestions that to a certain extent may or may not be dated. She gives some real specific examples of what we think activists can do to deal with the Commerce Clause as its anti-democratic being is, and how we can go about trying to come together and empower Congress, and by definition, empowering us to take charge. So I don't know if anyone has any general comments or specific comments, starting with the, first section of the preceding chapter with, it begins with the National Labor Relations Act of 1935, sort of as it came to exist, of being just the ultimate, definitional child of the Commerce Clause. So earlier on, there was certainly an effort not to have that be the case. Okay, Margaret.
So I was struck by noticing that the switch away from justifying everything by the Commerce Clause to narrowing it down that she describes as happening in the 1990s, that the first cases apparently were gun cases. That is really live for me today, because there's a high school in Southern California where I live. I mean, it's not in my town, but I am in Southern California. That's been on lockdown 2 days in a row. Yesterday, a student was found with a gun, and today 2 more students were found with a gun. Fortunately, there was no shooting, but it just so distressing that, all the statistics and everything show that we all want something done about it, and the problem is the Supreme Court. They're part of the problem, big part of the problem. And by the end of the book, I was like, okay, so I understand a lot more about this particular history about the Commerce Clause, but I think the even bigger point is that we invest way too much authority in the Supreme Court, and they seem to see themselves, and people see them as being in this really rarefied atmosphere, so that it's all very intellectual, and it's like angels dancing on the head of a pin. I was reading about or hearing about Moore versus US today, and this is like, can the US it's all comes down to one word in the whatever the amendment was that authorized the federal tax. And it's like, her point about how anti-democratic it is, how it just, the bottleneck gets narrower and narrower and narrower. So that in the end, there's just a few people discussing this in this very academic, intellectual way. And then they decide things that affect all of us, and often against our will. It's really infuriating. Pass.
And just for those who aren't quite sure, those 3 cases that Margaret referred to are delineated on page 122, beginning from 1995 to 2000. And 2 of those 3 cases, are gun related.
I don't know if that was a coincidence, or had the court changed its composition then, or why it would be gun cases that would cause them to go away from the hey whatever clause to the gee, we're going to be picky clause. But
isn't that a great term? I really like that term of hey whatever, which certainly kind of reinforced what she talks about on page 129 of the random positive reinforcement of just, when you make stuff just completely discretionary or random, we have no way to predict going in. And so that empowers then the entities who are making the decisions. They become even more powerful because you have no way to predict. And, if you have some way to predict, you can try to organize, you can try to give alternative opinions, something like that. But when it's completely random, you have no idea where something's coming. It's sort of a combination of centralized power and guerrilla power, where it's just coming from who knows where, the attack. Kevin, and you're on mute.
Yeah, I was
And please,
very
and
interested
again,
in,
just again, forgot with Margaret, who you are and where you're from.
yeah, this is Kevin Morford. I'm with the Anchorage, Alaska chapter of Move to Amend. And I was very interested in the discussion of the efforts by labor in the aftermath of the civil rights amendments to get labor rights based and founded upon especially the 13th Amendment, but also the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Those efforts, of course, came out of a political context. Not only had they recently had slavery, which dealt with human labor as a commodity, but also they were not that far removed, and I don't know how exactly when it ended, but involuntary servitude, I mean, not involuntary servitude, indentured servitude. A lot of people who came to the United States financed their passage here by agreeing to become indentured servants, and they had to serve 7 years or whatever the time frame was in their indenture, working essentially for free to pay off the cost of their passage to the United States. And so this idea of the commodification of labor was well entrenched in people's consciousness at the time of those civil rights amendments. And that, you know, to a much greater extent than they are today. And that can explain why there was this tremendous effort to get labor rights to be based on the 13th Amendment and the 14th Amendment rather than on the Commerce Clause, rights which, of course, as our author points out, were rejected by the courts pretty uniformly. This also ties into a political reform that was made called the Australian ballot. That's the form of ballot that most states in this country use today. And before the Australian ballot, the way you would cast your vote was much more public. There was not a secret ballot, and your employers would often insist upon knowing how you voted in elections that were taking place, and they could get that information easily. And so the Australian ballot was enacted as a reform to abolish that system of employer control over their employees, and hopefully free up democratic systems to some extent. But that's also an example of how people were very much aware of the dangers of the commodification of labor as a system in the country at the time. And so I found that very interesting as a little historical background, some of which I was not aware of before in that part of the book. Pass.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. I mean, the whole connecting labor power to the 13th Amendment. A guy named Peter Kellman with POCLAD. If you go to the POCLAD website and you search for his articles, Peter Kellman, Kellman, he worked for paper workers, I think the name. And he wrote a pamphlet booklet called Building Unions that just really dives into the 13th Amendment as, the labor amendments. He thought this was unlocking the key. Thank you very much, initially applied to give, end of slavery, but involuntary servitude was a form of slavery if you were not an artist, and you worked for an employer and you weren't able to organize. This was a means of doing it, and it really gets, really gets into it in the section called "All Slaves Together: 19th Century Labor," beginning on page 112. And just to kind of, if you didn't sort of appreciate this, what was defined as the whole theory of labor, asserting a primal connection between self-reliance and self-governance, citizenship, not commerce, linking the two. And then there's like an 8-step to this argument that begins on the bottom of 113 and then goes down to the 3/4 of 114, with, the last step being, therefore, the right to organize and strike is critical to guaranteeing a Republican form of government. So it was all about not even so much of fair, wages or benefits. The first union, from what Peter said, was the New York, basically major union was the New York Union, and the two main points, he said, of the union wasn't even better wages. It was the 8-hour workday and public education. You needed public education and the 8-hour workday to have real authentic democracy. So workers, back in the early 1800s, that was sort of their frame and their mindset. And so this 13th Amendment was just, truly liberating, that they thought, we can now have rights as working people. We're not, commercial beings. We're human beings.
And it would be interesting to see what the legislative history was on the passage of the 13th Amendment, whether there was discussion about the intended scope during when that was being debated in Congress.
Well, she does get into that when talking about the NLRB. Where is it? That is under the New Deal era, and it was then. It's on page 118, like halfway down the paragraph that says the NLRA campaign, writes James Gray Pope, featured sharp debate among the bill's proponents over the choice of the constitutional foundations. So how is it going to be defined? How is it going to be anchored, if you will? Was it going to be a commodity anchor, or worker rights, human rights, civil rights anchor? And obviously the capitalists wanted the commercial, but even the Roosevelt administration, because as he said, it's easier here. He thought it was easier to sort of control labor if they were defined as commerce and the commodification of work than if it's just basic labor rights. Margaret.
So I don't remember if it was discussed particularly with regard to that particular episode about the Labor Relations Act, but she refers from time to time about this sort of process people go through of trying to sort of read the tea leaves. So, I want to propose legislation, and legislation has to do with this topic. And so what's the history of Supreme Court rulings, and what is the constitutional peg, as she calls it, that I could hang it on to try to have it survive a challenge? And I gather from some, when she talks about constitutional pegs and which ones were chosen, that was part of the process of people trying to protect what they were advocating for, to try to protect it from a future Supreme Court, which is just sort of, to me, just re-underlines the point that the Supreme Court has way too much authority.
And again, this sort of issue of, what's the term? Hey, whatever. Who the hell knows what they're doing? And I loved how she coined this term, sort of comparing rulings of the Supreme Court to resembling the response to hurricanes. Remember going over that, page 125, halfway down to third paragraph. This is how we respond to hurricanes, very much how, communities respond to Congress rulings. First we forecast, then we worry, then we dodge, then we hunker down, then we pick through the wreckage and comfort the injured and grieving. And if we have been spared the time, we feel grieved and grateful, but Supreme Court rulings are not inevitabilities like Earth's spin itself.
Yeah. Jeff, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead, Jeff.
I'm sorry. Yeah,
And
that's,
who are you?
Jeff Clark in Minnesota, moved to a men in St. Paul. What did I want to say? Oh, one of the things I take the easy one I remember first is as you were going over the details on page 118, I had noticed also that among the people who eventually settled on the NLRA being based on the Commerce Clause was Roosevelt himself, which is kind of interesting considering he had also proposed a second Bill of Rights and the phrase that a necessitous man is not a free man, and by extension, you could say is not a full citizen when they're necessitous. But to have it based upon the Commerce Clause seems a little odd. Maybe it was a compromise for him in talking about that. I don't know, because I don't remember the details of his second Bill of Rights, all of them distinctly, but it would seem to be kind of an enhancement way beyond just considering the Commerce Clause as being the basis of defense for labor rights.
Interesting observation. Maybe, just maybe, it had a little bit to do, may have been other factors, but with history. You know, NLRB here came into being in 1935, Second Bill of Rights, sort of, right? Wasn't that after or near the end of World War II?
I think so, yeah.
The recognition could be that, my God, with so many inequalities out there, that may be one of the many, of course, triggers of war and violence. But inequality, and if we can have certain basic fundamental rights that transcend politics and include economics, who knows, maybe we can forestall this kind of potential conflagration that we just witnessed.
Yeah, that would make sense. Yeah.
Others, Sandy, I thought I saw your hand.
Yeah, I was just going to say,
and who are you?
I'm Sandy Boltingas, and I'm Columbus, Ohio. And just a point on that, yeah, with World War II, labor was an issue. You know, to fight the war to win, we had to have the workers there. So that might have been moving into Roosevelt's thinking. But at any rate, so what was the question? What's everybody responding to? I mean, what is, we're supposed to introduce ourselves and just say something about what we got out of the book, or
just any reactions or reflections.
Oh, reactions. Okay, my reaction really easy. I was waiting for the end of the book because I want to find out what do we do about this, and she goes into that, which is really great. Basically, this idea where I disagreed with her when she said we just don't know what the Supreme Court's gonna do, and I'm like, I think we kind of do. They're gonna side with the big corporate interest, and they will, you know, find any angle and work themselves into that in any way they need to allow the big guys with the money, how a lot of them got into the position in the first place, to win out. So to me, it's not that, you know, so that's why I liked her response at the end, that one way is to just tell the Supreme Court. I mean, the Congress gave the Supreme Court so much of its powers, so Congress needs to take away those powers. And who's Congress? It's the people. The people are supposed to be everywhere. It's supposed to be, our government's supposed to be, you know, focus on us in every which way. The fact that it's not is because the Supreme Court's got out of hand. So anyway, I like the solution to it.
Yeah, all that stuff is
solution.
on 132 and 133 under the subtitle "Try This at Home."
Yeah.
But one thing she said, I thought was, I think I'll remember this long after I don't remember the title of this book, is how she described a starving person in a cage. And, you know, that, we do this all the time. Something happens with the law, with the Supreme Court judgments, and it's really bad. But, at least we are still alive and able to carry on the next day. And it seems like we have a democracy because no one's in jail for this. And it just goes on and on and on. And we're just we're satisfied with table scraps. Even though these Supreme Courts are making judgments that are affecting all of us, not just here in the United States, but around the world. And we just accept it. What can we do? I guess that's the way it is. Thank God it wasn't any worse, which, like, how much worse can it be? Sometimes you want to know. So I thought that was I think we've got to, I never thought about this stuff about the Commerce Clause, to be honest, before I started reading this book. And so, or much about it, I should say. And I think it's high time that, people start focusing on this, on the Commerce Clause, because it opens up discussion about why do we have these laws? Who's running the Supreme Court? And really, do we need a Supreme Court?
And that was one of the items. Was one of the items.
Yeah, I've wondered that for a
suggested.
while. Do we need a Supreme Court?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Margaret says note number 4 at the bottom of page 133.
Right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Solutions, yeah. I was just thinking too, maybe a little bit more optimism or open-endedness on the part of Jane Ann might have been, because that was back in 2008 when it was copyrighted. If she were writing this today, maybe it would have been a little different in terms of conclusions. The other thing about these, Margaret just pointing out those 4 or 5 solutions, number 4, their ways of dealing with the court. There is another one that's come up I haven't seen talked about very recently, but I think Tom Hartman alerted me to it on one of his programs months ago. And I looked back on Chief Justice Roberts, when he was Reagan's lawyer, suggested another method that he thought would fly in terms of working with the court and getting it away from judicial review. You can actually draft the legislation that is passed by Congress and then signed by the president, put a rider on it saying this legislation is not reviewable by the Supreme Court, or however it was phrased, I forgot. And Roberts had said at the time that could fly. That's perfectly legitimate to do that. Let's try it. Reagan didn't try it, but that is certainly something that Congress could do if they had enough votes to go with it, plus the spine to actually do it.
Yeah, kind of the nuclear option.
Yeah, that's an alternative to simply turning your back on the court and saying, judicial review is not in the Constitution. You may find it somewhere in the judiciary acts that we've passed since the beginning, or some justification for it. But since it's not in the Constitution, let's just ignore you until the voters tell us we're wrong and you're right. Is a more elegant way to target it would be to put that kind of rider in legislation.
Hartman deals with that in his
he does.
pamphlets. Okay. Yeah,
I haven't read that. No.
Yeah, he's come up with a number of these little pamphlets. They aren't real thick at all. They're soft cover, but this one on the Constitution is really excellent. Okay. And he deals with them.
They make for great Christmas gifts.
Little light reading under the Christmas tree, huh? Related to that, just before going on, of what people can do, is we have to make sure that when we are acting, that we make sure we don't let our elected representatives off the hook, because she deals with that in this book. And what is it called? Like Higher Authority, on page 130. This whole section, bottom of page 130, where she talks about, public officials more than love to hide behind anything. I mean, not just Commerce Clause. There's all sorts of stuff that if they can wash their hands clean of, well, that's somebody else should be doing that, then, it's one less call that has to be responded to, one less email that has to be, sent and the like.
Yeah.
And certainly Commerce Clause is just a wonderful way to get them off the hook.
Mhm.
When, in the case of Congress, they have the ultimate power to change things. But do they have the spine? And do they have the will? Yeah, Kevin.
Yeah, I certainly have many criticisms of the US Constitution, but one of the things that I think that they did get right was the idea of separation of powers, checks and balances, making sure that power is not concentrated in just one or a few hands, but is dispersed across multiple different branches of government and between the states and the federal government. And a lot of the case law regarding the Commerce Clause has to do with issues of federalism, how power is distributed. And there are examples of times when at the national level, Congress has done some sort of reform or remedial act that powerful economic interests did not like, and the Supreme Court has struck it down on the grounds that this is not a power that was granted to the Congress. And similarly, there are many examples where state or local governments have passed remedial acts trying to cure some evil that powerful economic interests did not like, and they went to the courts, and the court has struck down local legislation on the grounds that it's unconstitutional under our federal system of government. But really, it's a zero-sum game. Every time the court is saying that Congress does not have that power under the Ninth Amendment to the United States Constitution, that automatically means that the state or local governments do have that power if they choose to exercise it. And conversely, if the Supreme Court says that a state or local government does not have that power because it's reserved to the feds under the Commerce Clause, that means that the Congress can do it. And so it's easy to criticize the court for one decision or another, but always the power is going to rest somewhere unless it's being struck down on some other grounds than the Commerce Clause. I mean, the Commerce Clause is one of the enumeration of powers that's granted to Congress. And under the Ninth Amendment, if it's not granted to Congress, then automatically it is retained by the states. Now, the states can't still act in discriminatory ways. There's other provisions of the Constitution that prevent the states from doing certain types of things. But good remedial legislation can be done at either the federal level or the state level. And while the court has worked in some cases to strike down remedial legislation that people want, that power is likely to exist somewhere. And it's easy if you overreact to a particular decision saying this power is only at the federal level or this power is only at the state level. It's a complex topic, and it's easy for there to be unintended consequences from the decisions that are made regarding these federalism issues. And so I just caution against automatically saying, oh, we should always allow Congress to act, or always allow the states to act, because states and Congress have also all done bad things. One of the remedial measures that was suggested on page 133 had to do with prohibiting the U.S. Supreme Court from declaring any state law unconstitutional. Well, if that were a rule that was in effect, there wouldn't have been striking down. I just exercise some caution in thinking carefully about remedial measures before advocating for them. Pass.
Yeah, well said. And we're now
in Troy, Ohio. I'm with Move to Amend Miami County, Ohio, and also Greater Dayton. So basically, another couple of things that just really hit me was the idea of self-preservation versus the Commerce Clause or free trade. But also when Jane was talking about how historically, going back to the Ice Age, society, culture, religion took precedence over economic concerns, and then how that changed and economic concerns sort of took over. And I thought those were very interesting ideas among all the others. Pass.
Yeah, page 127 and 120, bottom of 127 talks about that. Lost the connection between society and economy. Now it's just, economic transaction. Who the hell are we trading? It doesn't matter. But it used to be, it was based on trust. And David Graeber, who, if you know that name and you've ever run into any of his stuff, just an incredible anthropologist, deceased, unfortunately. The book Debt, 5,000 Years. And he's done some other wonderful things, but he talks a lot about how economy and society go hand in hand, and how the strength of a civil society rests on those mutual relationships that are in part social, but in part economic.
Mm.
I really like how we voice our thoughts in basing labor laws on the 13th Amendment and reasons why, and how laborers' choice of where they work and what they work for, their conditions and all these kind of things, what's important to them allows them to be better citizens and more, being better citizens, being happier, being productive, having time to learn more about things. You can't learn a whole lot if you're working 18 hours a day, every day of the week. The idea of having lectures open to them and later on, these are more important than in the seeking of a better world, a better democracy. And 13th Amendment was perfect for that, but that's been sidelined by the Commerce Clause. It's all about it's all about commodities, and labor's a commodity. Great.
And part of the motive for the 8-hour excuse me, the 8-hour workday was to allow time not just for rest, but also to be engaged in, society. The self-preservation and the sense of freedom. Self-determination.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if Steve or Judy, Marcia, David, I don't want to put any of you on the spot, but do want to make sure that we do allow space for those of you not had an opportunity to share to do so. Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, I'm Judy. I'm outside of Seattle, Washington, and I really found it interesting. I just wondered everyone's thoughts on, she gave examples of what to advocate for as far as the Supreme Court and reining in that power. But this whole Commerce Clause and how it's become interpreted over public safety, and it's just all about commerce. Does anyone have thoughts on how we advocate to change that? Because this obviously was an issue long before the Citizens United, and so that seems like the biggest issue here.
It's a really good question. And I think, as Jeff said, this book was written in 2008. A lot has changed, including the pandemic, where a lot of individuals who were, doing basic life support work looked at that work as incredibly important, and that they weren't just grunts, delivering meals or taking care of senior citizens or whatever, and that we need to look at ourselves doing this as incredibly important, and not just define ourselves as what we're paid. So I think there is some rethinking that's going on, some re-identification culturally that's happening, and I see that to be good, and maybe others have examples of that.
It's also interesting during the pandemic that, which obviously she doesn't address here, but workers were forced to work or lose their job. And they were unlike not necessarily the strike issue, but they were forced to go to work when they were afraid to, because of the catching COVID, getting sick, dying. So yeah, I think it's a very important part that people realize, or people, our country at that time at least, was saying everybody's valuable. You're very essential workers.
Yeah, Deb, you.
Yeah, I was just going to say that one of the things that I think makes it difficult to make change is this idea that people think of all of this stuff as being like natural law. I can't remember where in these two chapters Jane Ann mentions it, but people accepting things like these decisions about commerce as being sort of natural law. And how do we change that? So I see that as an obstacle, that view. Pass.
Yeah, they conflate markets with capitalism. We've always had markets, but markets haven't always been capitalistic.
Right.
And Margaret in chat, in case you didn't see it, those of you maybe, I don't know if you were called in, I guess not. Law follows culture. It takes a long time sometimes, but it does happen. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Others who maybe haven't had a chance.
Hi, my name is Marcia Schultz, and I'm calling from Silver Lake, Ohio, in northeastern Ohio here. And actually, I haven't read the book at all, but I saw it on the site. I'm not sure how I missed it, but I did. And I thought I would listen in, to learn more. And the conversation's been really interesting. I'm learning a lot. I plan to read it. I never really thought much about commodification of labor, but I am very interested in that concept now, and also always been really intrigued about the power of the Supreme Court. So I'm grateful to be a participant and to hear all this wonderful conversation. Thank you very much. That's it. Didn't know how to raise my hand here. I couldn't find the raise hand button.
Oh, that's all right. You do the physical part, and you can get the book What a Deal, only $10. So you can do it, read it.
Mm.
If you have any questions, I'm in your neck of the woods. Feel free to
I
reach out.
plan on it. I definitely plan on
Okay,
it.
great.
Thanks.
Yep. Wonderful. Other comments, queries? One thing that struck me is the 18, just real quick, the Commerce Clause was used in ways that, of course, benefited capital and hurt workers, including the interpretation of the Sherman Antitrust Act. That was passed in 1890, specifically identified exclusively to break up the, huge monopolies of the robber baron era. But early on in the interpretation, just like the 14th Amendment, most of the early on decisions weren't protecting freed slaves, but rather corporations. Well, the interpretation of the Sherman Antitrust Act, which came before courts, was to look at unions as sort of trusts, as conspiracies of people against business. So it was used a hell of a lot more time to target organized people than organized capital.
Mhm.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. One of the things I wanted to mention to this group is that our local chapter of Move to Amend has ordered 10 copies of the book so that we can potentially host a similar book group discussion similar to this one locally here in the Anchorage area. And anyone else that is enjoying this might consider that as a way of generating more interest in our issues and topics in their own local areas. Pass.
Is that going to be physical or is it going to be virtual?
We haven't set the details yet. We've ordered the books and we're busy with another project right now, but later this winter we'll probably be working on the details of that.
Well, something, I don't know how in-house totally wanted to make it, but if you wanted to open it up, you could let, Move to Amend know, and people like, for example, Marcia, who is, intrigued by this, who would, get the book, might want to join in. Now, you may want to just have it in-house, and that's perfectly fine. But if not, just, let us know.
No, that's a
Well,
great suggestion, and I'll pass it on to our group, and I appreciate that.
You may get some outliers from crazy places like Ohio.
Great.
So as we think about this book and all we've read, and Marcia, you'll really like this book, then, I'm thinking, okay, what will I tell friends and activists after this? What are the solutions? I think everybody kind of familiar with the problems. Citizens United, everybody knows that's a problem, and that's an easy one. And if anything, that the one positive thing, the only positive result of Citizens United is that it did turn people's attention to the court and to how they overreach on the craziest things. They're having sessions on issues that are not even haven't even happened before or thought about happening. They make up cases and decide them based on these made up cases these days. It's unbelievable. So I'm just thinking, when we're talking to people, what we say to them. I mean, I'm very much for, I don't think we can get rid of the Supreme Court, or maybe we don't even really want to get rid of it, but we certainly want to rein it in. And this judicial review, I mean, have Congress involved. But I guess I'm throwing it out to you guys, like, what will you tell people about? We all know the problem. How can we resolve it?
Well, bottom of page 132, top of page 133, the very first thing Jane Ann talks about in trying this at home is, there's all this growing international movement about free trade around all these international so-called trade agreements. But we need to launch a comparable all-out effort to acquaint ourselves with the fact that we are already suffering the results of a century-plus long free trade zone in the U.S. It has butchered state and local sovereignty. Then we can lay claim to the state and local power of legislative bodies to pass laws to protect their communities. So part of that is to point out how the courts have sort of hijacked the Commerce Clause and to acquaint people. Before, like POCLAD, before Women's International League for Peace and Freedom in the mid to early 90s, who the hell knew about quote unquote corporate personhood? Hardly anybody. But it was citizens that sort of, introduced that notion and got people, on the other side of the learning curve. So, the notion and the idea of what this tool is of the Commerce Clause and how it has been so misused and not really intended to be used in this way, but has been sort of handed over by Congress without even being, a gun put to their head, or people, hogtied and thrown in a basement somewhere, but sort of willingly being done. She talks about, hey, this has been done, it can be undone.
Mhm.
Yes, I wasn't sure how she meant to do that. I mean, she does say corporations are chartered and, we're the ones the people are the ones giving it its power. So we need to revisit that, which we're trying to do here in Ohio, but in fact, but have a movement on that. And then she says what Congress can give, Congress can take away with judicial review. But I wasn't quite sure how she meant to affect just what you mentioned, Greg. There's much work to be done on the home front, dismantling our own free trade zone. We are free trade veterans and need to act like it. That's on 133 in the middle of the page.
Mhm.
But how do you, that's what I don't get, like how to dismantle. I was a little bit cloudy on what she meant about how we're going to dismantle it. I know what she means by all the words, but I don't know how she means to do this.
Yeah, well, this is a big book. You're not going to get the masses to do what we're doing. But what you do is, when people like us go through it, and all right, now our job now is to take the complex and make it simple without it being simplistic. So it's to develop, shorter pieces.
Mhm.
Educate that talks about the Commerce Clause. It talks about how the, Supreme Court is hijacked. It talks about how the Supreme Court, the Supreme Court, right now, people are against the Supreme Court because of Clarence Thomas, right? Or Alito. And it's not so much, they're scoundrels and violating ethics and all, but it's also part of the power they have, my God. And so it's talking about not just the persons, but the positions and the roles. So dealing with that and developing some material on it, just as we do everything else, developing education materials around. Who out there is put together? I don't know anybody that's put anything together around the Commerce Clause. It's sort of a workshop like, or, one session, or here's a flyer, here's a 3-minute PowerPoint or meme, or, who's done that? Maybe somebody has. I don't know. Judy, I saw your hand was up.
Yeah, I think reading this and really seeing how the Commerce Clause has been abused, and then hearing about the courts and how it is all arbitrary of how they're making decisions and there's no guidelines around it. And as someone brought up, now they're seeing cases that are all theoretical, and that goes against what they've even stated that they're meant to do. This has really crystallized for me that, I've always been nervous about hearing about states' rights and having them be able to decide everything, because you have the states that want to, restrict civil rights. And so this has helped crystallize that for me, that I think states' rights are really important around safety issues. And reading about all the instances where states have tried to protect themselves against toxic waste and bad food and all of those things, and been told, no, you don't have the right to do that. So I do really believe that states should have the right to protect themselves in those kinds of instances from public safety, but draw the line at the civil rights. And reading about like the guns in schools and knocking down parts of the Violence Against Women Act, and we had California trying to do, I guess that was back to the safety, the restrictions on emissions, and set their own standards and be told, no, you're not allowed to do that because it hurts the automakers. So it's helped me become more comfortable with boundaries of, yes, there's states' rights on some issues and not states' rights on other issues when it comes to individuals so that they can't discriminate against people.
And she talks about the democratic, what's called police power, page 127. And some good quotes there about acts of self-preservation. Okay, David, Steve, Jenny, I don't know if any of you have any thoughts you wish to share. I'm compelled to, but just wanted to
Jenny's on
make the
stack.
space. Oh, I'm sorry, missed that. Go ahead, Jenny.
Hey, yeah, you did cover some of what I was going to say
Hmm.
already. You know, in what she writes too is that more or less this, including the global corporatization of free trade, these are reruns, right? They've already perfected this. They're masters at it. And really short of the wholesale systemic political transformation, is what we would need to reverse all of these insane decisions. That being said, there are some tweaks that we can do along the way that we know, but the list that she gives, the 5 here, in allowing a national referendum to override Supreme Court declarations of unconstitutionality, I think is a powerful one. I don't know about giving the Senate the power or the Congress the power, but you know, the people the power. I think that that would be a powerful instrument for the people. But and you know, a constitution change to the Constitution, which we all know, and most of us are working on anyway. So, but yeah, it's I'm with you too, Sandy. I think it was that talked about had no idea about this prior, and I see you, Deb. I'm done. I just wanted to raise that up. You had covered most of what I was going to say already.
Yeah, thanks, Deb. Yeah, all good points. Well, any other sort of, I don't know if they're closing thoughts or, you know, where people's energies are here, or any other burning notions.
I have something very quick.
Please.
I liked her wording. Among 2 things. So she says at one point, all this without reducing society's values to cheap baubles on economy's purse. What an image. I really like that. Cheap baubles on economy's purse. That's our values because of things that have happened. And then the line, this is on page 127, but and then she said, historically, and I mean back to the last ice age, economic concerns played second fiddle to customs, values, and religion. But I mean, okay, she's very clear about that. She's really pinpointing what she means by historically, which is everything.
You can't get more basic than that.
There were just things like that I saw throughout. Those are just 2 I'm going to throw out, mention right now.
Jenny Stack.
Yeah, go ahead, Jen.
And I have one more thing I wanted to add. Somebody had mentioned, you know, because this book was written a couple of years ago, and everything moves in such a rapid pace now. With now, you know, how does the surveillance state now add or influence what was always you know, movements crushed and I don't know, just how does that play into those historic relevances, right? I mean, it's kind of really in this last chapter, I just kept thinking of like 1984, you know, and that I don't know, just
Well,
how it would play into how it plays into the overall scheme of things and where we're at now too, with, you know, we're facing species annihilation. We, you know, you can be seen from every corner in the country. There's, you know, how labor was, the Marshall Act was used to to target labor and you know, identify them as terrorists. And you know, I don't know why it just reminded me of that book so much in this last chapter, and that was my only other thing I wanted to add.
The thing, of course, that she was unable to contemplate, that none of us were able, basically, probably almost none of us, to contemplate back in 2008, that is an increasing, I mean, rapidly increasing reality all around us, is AI, and how artificial intelligence now plays into, you know, quote unquote, rights versus commerce. Because again, that's how all of these parts in this book, that has been sort of the tipping point. Are we going to define people of color as having inalienable rights, or simply allowed to cross one state border to another because they're on a bus and they paid a fare, and thus they're a commercial being? Are we going to, you know, look at labor as having basic rights to produce things and be paid a fair wage and treated fairly, and, you know, have the freedom of conscience and self-preservation? Or are they just simply a cog in a machine? Again, commerce. And the environment, you know, is this there just to plunder, as just a, you know, commercial thing to draw upon and to, you know, put waste in? Or does it have, you know, inherent value and the like? Well, you know, artificial intelligence, my God, you know, rights versus commerce versus property. And when it comes to the rights thing, there's already discussion, and some parts of the world have already given, like, artificial intelligent robots constitutional rights in limited ways. So, geez, I mean, there's just a whole, you know, whole new, new area of the law around artificial intelligence that who knows how that weighs in. But the one thing that's sure is that every technology that's been developed, you know, where, oh, this is going to result in less labor for, you know, this washing machine, sewing machine for women, all that stuff, it doesn't, in essence. You know, it just means you can be more productive and the like. So technology generally is not the savior at all. Is not the objective. Margaret.
So just what Jenny was bringing up about the surveillance state. So, you know, that's going to be another whole arena where there, you know, the government entities are using surveillance, but so are business entities. So the whole, I just am sort of visioning of, you know, a bunch of people going back and forth, crossing lines. The cases that will eventually come up, you know, will also involve this interplay between the police powers of governments and the quote unquote rights of commerce. So, as it's not just government, it's not just business, that this surveillance is, you know, pervasive across all sectors. Pass.
All right. Well, any, I don't know, are we at the point of any closing muses?
I'd like to open up one more train of thought on the way out, but with the changes that are going on with space law, and you know, it just kind of makes you wonder, what all have they found? Because of how much energy is being put into this space force, and space law is building, and you know, they're offshoring the idea of free trade zones and agreements in off planet too. So I just want to leave that as something else we must worry about. No, but you know, and also consider and contemplate, because it's becoming a reality, you know, and these aren't farcical ideas anymore. These are things that are happening in real world time and right now. So I know it's a little off topic, but it's not, because they've perfected it, right?
Yeah. Well, pretty soon AI will be able to figure that all out for us. The first thing we need to do when we reach this, well, maybe it's before we reach the singularity, but to have AI developed to replace corporate executives and the Supreme Court. We don't need real people. We just need an entity, a consciousness that's based on the principles we want to promulgate, and which we've been discussing, and Jane Ann's been discussing, about not looking at everything as property and commerce. But yes, that's a bit facetious, but that would be two things. Rather than replacing workers, replace people who make decisions at the top that are extremely flawed and have the most impact on everyone else. But one other thing, I had a couple of nits, if I can, unless anybody wants to say anything about that, is I had wondered in the exchanges, and I think she dealt with this at one point, the business about genetically modified crops and farmers who were not raising them, but their crops got polluted by genetically modified seeds that drifted onto their land, and they're being responsible for it. There's another aspect around that I wondered why I had not seen any case argued for it under the Commerce Clause, is that same thing can happen to well-defined smaller markets like those who want organic produce. When their crops for their market, which has been identified, that's why they're in that business, gets polluted by crops that their audience do not want. They don't want GMO foods. Why are not cases brought up saying this is a violation of the Commerce Clause? You're restraining our restraint of trade for us. We have a market, and what you're doing at Monsanto is destroying our market and the people who depend on us. I don't know why that kind of argument has never been made. There may be a way to turn the Commerce Clause, while we've still got to live with it as being predominant, turn it against itself or against the interests who favor that method of doing things.
Interesting.
So,
yeah, good thought. Before Sandy goes, I just wanted to share two things real quick, and that is the appendix. There's two appendices, and the first one we referred to in session 1 in dealing with the international tree zone, but it's a good piece to just go back and remind oneself about, because it looks at what Jane Ann calls the family resemblances between NAFTA, WTO, and the Supreme Court.
right.
How some of the basic, arcs are the same. You call them, different levels, different layers, different terms, some different languages, of course. Internationally, people speak different languages, but the basic arc or format is the same. And then Appendix B is a really nice piece, and this may be a road, Sandy, entry point for people who don't know anything about this. And that is the legislation, mostly at the state level. There have been 9 instances of federal cases that have been overturned on Commerce Clause, but a whole heck of them, about 350 state and local ordinances that have been overturned by the court in the Commerce Clause. And it basically identifies them. So here's their instances, right? Where, hey, we elect our city council people, we elect our state people. All right, relatively speaking, it's all relative, of course, Democratic elected representatives. But sometimes, I don't know if any of them here are actually things that were enacted by citizen initiative, but conceivably they could have a citizen initiative on any of these things. They get passed, they get overruled as unconstitutional under the Commerce Clause. So that should, really piss off people at a local level across the political spectrum. Local or state laws, or in some cases, federal legislation. So to familiarize yourself in general with what these are, what they deal with, the subject matter, I think there's a chart, a couple of them that deals with the subject matters. You know, it's another resource. I'll leave it there. Anyone else have any sort of closing? All right, well, if not, appreciate everyone taking the time, a little shameless self-promotion, move to amend. It is end of year fundraising. If you've not had an opportunity to help us out, we could use your support. If you're not a donor, whether it's a one-time at the end of the year or sustainer giving $5, $10 a month, we invite you to do that because we don't get a nickel from any super duper major millionaires, billionaires, major corporations, big foundations, political parties, or government. We rely on people at the grassroots. We truly are economically and politically independent because they go hand in hand. So go to movetoamend.org/donate to help us out. So enough of that. Thanks so much for helping us out, for being a part of this. Hope you found it at least somewhat useful. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions to me.
Thanks so much for putting it together, Greg.
Thank you all. Powerful discussion. You are brilliant.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Spread the word about the book. It's only $10. It's from our store. Do what Alaska's doing.
Bye, guys.
I know.
Bye-bye.
Sorry, my internet's been unstable.